honor to be here. To Nigel and Reform for inviting me to speak today. Ancient wisdom teaches us that evil is rooted in ignorance. But what's worse than ignorance? The illusion of knowledge. That means that barriers to the truth are often more psychological than they are intellectual. My purpose as a doctor is to do my best for patients, to improve their outcomes. And in fact, this is probably maybe the most important slide of my whole talk. Please feel free to take a picture of it. If you understand this, everything falls into place. This is the evidence-based medicine triad. Developed in 1996, an analytical framework for teaching and practicing medicine. So what does it mean? We use our individual clinical expertise, the best available evidence on a drug treatment, on a lifestyle intervention, on a surgery, on a test, and last but not least, most important, to take into consideration individual patient preferences and values. It's called informed consent. In order to manage risks, treat illness, and relieve suffering. But unfortunately, evidence-based medicine has become an illusion. It has become hijacked by powerful commercial interests. And as a result, we have an epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients. This is the root cause of our healthcare crisis. What are those root causes? Biased funding of research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals. Biased reporting in the media, biased patient pamphlets, commercial conflicts of interest, defensive medicine, and last but not least, an inability of doctors to understand and then communicate health statistics. Somebody who I describe as a Stephen Hawking of medicine is Professor John Ioannidis at Stanford. The reason I call him the Stephen Hawking of medicine, he's the most cited medical researcher in the world. He's considered to have very high integrity. And in 2017, he published this paper called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And he makes the point that 20 to 50% of all healthcare activity in the United States brings no benefit to the patient, is wasteful or harmful. That's quite extraordinary. Why? Again, he reiterates the fact that most published research is unreliable, offers no benefit to patients, and is not useful to decision makers. But why does this persist? Because most doctors don't know that. Medical knowledge is under commercial control, but most doctors and healthcare professionals are unaware of it. And then they lack the skills to be able to understand and critically appraise the reliability of medical evidence. And last but not least, most importantly, patients and families then get inaccurate medical information and therefore cannot make decisions that are going to be important for their health outcomes. Now, there's something really important for people to understand. And I spoke in 2018 in the European Parliament, invited at that point by MEP Nathan Gill, and I made a few very important statements that everybody needs to acknowledge. The pharmaceutical industry have a legal responsibility to provide profit for their shareholders. They do not have a legal requirement to give us the best treatment, even though most of us would like or presume that to be the case. But the real scandals are these. Those who have a responsibility to integrity and patient care, doctors, academic institutions, and medical journals, regulators, collude with industry for financial gain. And in 2018, I said the situation has become so dire that honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. This is pre-pandemic. At the end of 2022, and a lot of you may know my story anyway, I published a paper in the Journal of Industry that says peer-reviewed, still stands up to scrutiny, and I basically called for a moratorium on the COVID mRNA vaccines. And I won't bore you with lots of data. I'm going to give you just one particular study that's most important for you to realize. But the reason I bring this up is after I published this paper, the only broadcast media at the time that was willing to talk about it and get me on and report on it as a news story was GB News. So thank you, GB News, by the way, for standing up for free speech. And as soon as I walked out of the studio, I was pleasantly surprised to receive a phone call from Robert Kennedy Jr. And he said, Dr. Malhotra, I want to thank you for your courage. And that's how our relationship, our friendship, our working relationship started. And he listened to me, and I basically essentially gave the whole root cause analysis of the healthcare crisis and exactly why we should pull the COVID mRNA vaccine. So let's get on to that briefly. Now, we talk about levels of evidence, but in the highest quality level of evidence and real-world data, what patients need to understand is what benefit is a drug or intervention going to give them, and what are the absolute harms. And I'm citing here, by the way, what's interesting, the UK, and all credit to the UK for this, is the only country in the world, now it's not been well publicized, that has been transparent, the UK HSA, with the benefits of the COVID vaccine. At the beginning of 2023, it might be difficult to read, but I'm just going to explain it to you. At the beginning of 2023, if you were over 70, you had to vaccinate 2,500 people to prevent one hospitalization with COVID. As soon as you get into the under 50s age group, you're talking about hundreds of thousands. That was the beginning of 2023. Right now, the latest data, even for the highest risk, if you're over 90, is you have to vaccinate 7,000 people over the age of 90 to prevent one of them having a hospitalization with severe COVID. Now, if this wasn't such a serious issue, this would be laughable. We're having debates and discussions prior to this about statins, about people not being told that if you're at low risk of a heart attack, your benefit of a statin at best is 1%. That is where the debate has happened. This is thousands of people, right? Okay, if there was no harm, you can make the case for let's give it to everybody and we'll save some lives. But unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. A reanalysis of Pfizer and Moderna's trials, published in the journal Vaccine by some of the most eminent independent of industry influenced scientists in the world, including the associate editor of the BMJ, Peter Doshi, revealed that from the very beginning, the rate of harm from the original trials of Pfizer and Moderna reanalyzed, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to suffer serious harm from taking the COVID vaccine than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. Think about that for a second. What does that mean? It is highly likely not a single person should have been injected with this, what is better described as a gene therapy than as a vaccine. Now, this isn't the only bit of data. Lots of data has emerged since then. And as you've probably heard a few weeks ago, Robert Kennedy Jr., and I've been in constant communication with him, has ended in $500 million worth of investments in the mRNA technology for vaccines, which is a great achievement, I think, for him to do that. His chief medical officer, Stephen Hatfill, told Steve Bannon, he was involved in this, he called it a mega-analysis of all the data, hundreds of studies, peer-reviewed studies showing the harms of the mRNA vaccine, and he said the side effects of this gene therapy was so enormous and progressive, it was difficult to fathom. The millions of molecules of mRNA entering the cell is creating biochemical havoc, it's disrupting protein metabolism, it's interfering with tumor suppressor genes, it had to be stopped. Interfering with tumor suppressor genes, in other words, it may be a risk factor for cancer. And I've been asked today to share, this isn't just his opinion, many other doctors feel the same way, but one of Britain's most eminent oncologists, Professor Angelish, said to me to share with you today that he thinks it's highly likely that the COVID vaccines have been a factor, a significant factor, in the cancer of members of the royal family. What I'm telling you today is nobody is immune to medical misinformation because of this corrupted system. So let me explain, how did we get here and why have we got here? In public health, we talk about something called the commercial determinants of health. Strategies and approaches adopted by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. Okay? How do big corporations exert their power to influence us, the way we think, what we choose to buy, what drug we take, right? They do it through several mechanisms. They do it through influencing the political environment, by lobbying politicians. In 2012, when we launched Action on Sugar, I remember having a meeting with Jeremy Hunt, and the Daily Mail at that stage did a front-page story revealing that ministers in the Conservative government at the time had had 99 meetings with representatives of the food industry to discuss health policy on food, and 0 meetings with independent scientists. Okay? So the information politicians are getting, I know politicians from all parties, and I speak to them privately, a lot of them come to me for health advice, they genuinely don't realize that they are being manipulated for commercial influence. They control, they have the ability to define the narrative through capture of the media. When I was helping to overturn mandates for healthcare workers, for vaccines, I spoke to the chairman of the British Medical Association in December 2021. And I told him what was going on. He said, Aseem, nobody appears to have critically appraised the evidence as well as you have in terms of his colleagues in health policy and senior people. He said, most of my colleagues are getting their information on the COVID vaccine from the BBC. Think about that. The power of the media to shape the way we think, right? And who is ultimately controlling that narrative? Of course, there is also funding of medical education, funding of medical research that influences the bias. And then you've got other tactics, extra-legal tactics that they use to try and suppress or censor information getting out. Character assassinations of people, of whistleblowers, people trying to expose this problem. I've had my fair share. In fact, in the I newspaper today, the fact I'm speaking here today, they got Stephen Kinnock, who I've never met, and they've probably, not even told him exactly what I'm going to say, but they've basically done a story and told him to say that on stage today at the Reform Party conference is in quotes, anti-vax conspiracy theorists. Have you heard anything anti-vax or conspiracy theory so far here? No, these are cold, hard facts. This is how business is done. The general population don't know what's happening, and they don't even know that they don't know. Now, let's get to the diagnosis here. I'm a diagnostician as a doctor. One thing doctors do very well is making a diagnosis. What's the root cause of the problem? Over the last few decades, almost all the top 10 drug companies have been found guilty of fraud, totaling billions of dollars in fines for illegal marketing of drugs, hiding data on harms, manipulation of results. One of the most egregious acts was committed by Merck, who in 2011 were fined almost $1 billion for the way that they pushed and marketed their drug Vioxx, which was an anti-inflammatory drug. And in the litigation process, John Abramson from Harvard, who you can see in the picture speaking to Joe Rogan, there was documents released that the senior scientists of Merck, when the drug was being rolled out, which, by the way, was found to cause increased cardiovascular risk by 2 to 4-fold, responsible for the deaths of at least 60,000 Americans. In the original litigation, when the drug was being rolled out, there was an internal email by the executives, sent to the executives of Merck, which said, it's unfortunate about the cardiovascular risk of this drug, but we will do well, and the drug will do well. What kind of behavior would you describe that as? Criminal. Yeah, psychopathic, actually, and that's not being inflammatory. The person that came up with the original definition of psychopath, Robert Hare, forensic psychologist, in the book The Corporation actually says that big corporations as entities, okay, the way they conduct business actually fulfills the criteria for psychopathy. Callous unconcern for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt, repeated lying and conning others for profit. Does that sound familiar? Right? Now, Pfizer, when almost certainly in the summer of 2021, everybody knew that COVID, we can argue the toss about whether it was preventing serious illness and death, and you've already seen figures on that, but we knew that it wasn't stopping infection or transmission. What did they do behind the scenes? They're the ones that pushed the mandates. They funded grassroots organizations, medical organizations in the United States to push that mandates are necessary, and they've made $100 billion in profit. John Ioannidis also says, when it comes to medicine, from his own analysis, the greater the financial interest in a given field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. And when we're talking about one of the most lucrative products in the history of medicine, which is unsafe and defective, and in my view, will turn out to be one of the greatest medical mistakes. And in fact, the mistake is one thing, but the cover-up and suppression of this information is criminal, and people need to understand and treat it that way. So how can we solve, listen, how do we make Britain healthy again? I was involved in looking at all of this, and it's very difficult sometimes to sort out the wheat from the chaff. But essentially, with the medical royal colleges, I campaigned with them to try and improve informed consent with patients and push a lifestyle message. And we calculated, and I published this with one of the chairs of the medical royal colleges, Sue Bailey, in 2018, basically saying that if informed consent was to properly take place, patients choose less treatments, we improve lifestyle, we could save the NHS billions. and improve quality of care simultaneously. That's without putting more money into the NHS. And it was reported on in the Daily Express and the Daily Mail on about a patient that basically was a heart attack patient of mine who essentially changed his lifestyle, had fully informed consent, came off all his pills, and 10 years later he's breaking his own records at the age of 60 plus in ultramarathons. That's the potential of what can be achieved just through transparency and informed consent. Okay, I have to wrap up, but I'm just going to finish up. Give me a few more seconds, a minute or so. So what do we do about this? I think it's time to just say no to all new drugs that are being approved unless they are independently evaluated. Everybody just needs to say no. Over the last few years, it is very clear with the evidence that the drug industry are responsible for probably killing millions of people. And the COVID vaccine, if 1 in 800 was a figure of serious harm, and you translate across the word from the best quality of evidence, then it means the COVID mRNA jabs have likely killed or seriously harmed millions of people across the world. So, from now on, drug companies can develop drugs, but they should no longer be allowed to test them themselves. Our regulator, MHRA, takes 86% of its funding from Big Pharma. How is that acceptable? From these psychopathic entities, right? That is not acceptable. There needs to be independent funding of the regulator. Now, one of the ways that we can fight back, one of the front groups, if you like, unfortunately, of this message has been the World Health Organization that is being captured by Bill Gates, who is its largest funder now. Bill Gates, who made $500 million in investments in the COVID vaccines. Until the World Health Organization become independent, they should be reformed and they should be replaced, and we cannot carte blanche take their advice and act on their advice anymore. And I'm proud to say that I'm the Chief Health Advisor to Action and World Health, co-founded by Nigel Farage and by David Roach. And if there's one person in this country who is speaking up for truth, for honesty, for integrity, who can disrupt the system, and that's Nigel Farage, and we need to get him into number 10. So please help support Action and World Health. Go to actionworldhealth.org. And finally, at the end of this, all of this comes back to the fact that we have deviated as a society, our public officials, from a baseline of integrity. I am proud to be British. I am shaped by British values. My school, Manchester Grammar, which I'm very proud of, its motto in Latin is sapere aude. What does that mean? Dare to be wise. Do not let fear subdue your ability to reason. Action. Knowledge without action is vanity. Action without knowledge is insanity, and we've seen a lot of that in the last few years. But wisdom without courage is fruitless. So remember, it is health that is the real wealth. Let's stand up to this corporate tyranny, and let's overcome this organization of misery. Thank you very much.